First-person shooters that want to spook you real bad are an interesting subsection and melding of genres that, when separated, are trying to do two different things entirely, normally. I'm going to describe this in an extremely simplistic and borderline incorrect way. First-person shooters empower you by putting you directly into the perspective of the main character. You are the one doing all the cool stuff, not the person you're piloting like a meaty mech suit. While horror games try to disempower you by giving you fewer options to deal with conflict or by not giving you a way to deal with conflict at all. So first-person horror games that also have the DNA of a shooter are mishmashing a lot of ideas that usually oppose each other. But when done right, you get games like Doom 3 or Fear, where cool combat is interspersed throughout while building up atmosphere and surprising the player with spooky moments that rip away that sense of empowerment and leave you crying on the floor because a spooky little face said hello. Doom pioneered this hybridization though by making its levels and combat feel fast and snappy while still throwing surprises your way every time you'd see an enemy you didn't expect or when the lights in a room would suddenly go out. There's always been a really cool connection between horror and shooters where the contrast between giving the player power but also placing them in situations where that power is useless can offer up some memorable moments. Now, Resident Evil. It's got spooks, explosions, a weird fascination with making animals larger than they would be otherwise, and most importantly of all, Leon S. Kennedy. But what happens when you take a series that had a pretty big identity crisis in the early 2010s and fight to bring it back to its roots? What kind of game comes from that? Well, the answer is Revelations 2, but that's for another day, so let's talk about Resident Evil 7. At this point, I feel like we are all familiar with Resident Evil's course correction after a certain game in the franchise. The slow pace of RE was slowly getting faster and faster with each entry, until we started getting third-person shooters that had a different sort of recipe compared to what the original games were sort of cooking up. With each new entry, the flavor of RE would change slightly until it didn't really taste like 90s survival horror and instead more like a 7th gen third-person shooter, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because I like RE6 quite a bit, but comparing it to the fixed camera angle entries or even RE4 is a bit like comparing Evangelion to Transformers. Both are good, very different, but I know which one I'm putting out of the fire first. But I don't think the RE series' growing pains in the PS3/360 era were strictly due to the action formula that had grown to dominate the games. Because for the most part, all of the action-based RE games are pretty awesome. The problem, I think, was more so a sense of predictability. RE games just kind of became a little boring because there wasn't much to diversify each game outside of them becoming a little louder and flashier each time. So how in the hell does Capcom manage to deal with a horror series that's simply not scary anymore? Well, they make it scarier. Now, when I think of Resident Evil, I don't typically think about how scared it makes me. After all, I'm kind of a badass when it comes to this thing. As long as you aren't Silent Hill 4's big face room, because yeah, then that's when I don't really feel safe anymore. But honestly, there's a reason I love survival horror games more than any other horror genre, and it's because I like to kick ass as much as I piss my pants. It makes the experience more exciting to me when I can repay a jump scare by blasting it in the face with a shotgun. And that's always what Resident Evil has been to me. A series that lets you take on spooky monsters and by the end of the game, make them afraid of you. So honestly, Resident Evil 7 is quite a funny game to me because it feels like the only RE game that's oblique purpose is to make you afraid. It even has the indie horror game from 2012 ass opening where you walk around a forest, catch a glimpse of the monster, and slowly work your way up to increasingly scarier places before getting your hand cut off with a chainsaw. RE7 is fascinating for it being the franchise's first full-blooded cheek-to-cheek horror game that feels directly aimed at people that want to be frightened. And today, we are talking all about it. Fixed camera angles are, in my opinion, the optimal way to visually present a horror game. I'll also take straight up janky camera controls that are sort of reminiscent of fixed camera angles, but they're not really. They get bonus points if they are really hard to control, because not being able to even point a camera at what's scary makes things scarier, I think. But it's not just about the fear of it all. Fixed camera angles also ooze so much style and sauce when done correctly. Frankly, even if the shots themselves aren't great, I can't help but love the vibe of a fixed camera angle anyway. And it's what makes revisiting the classic RE games so fun for me still. RE1's bizarrely bright rooms contrasted with dark yet colourful hallways and grainy caverns give the game such a distinct visual texture, which was developed much further in RE2 and 3 to be more detailed and have more realistic lighting patterns. RE Remake and Zero both offer the highest quality pre-rendered backgrounds in the series, which present RE with a much more realistic sort of vibe. But you still get those dark and grungy shots that give the scenes a lot of visual texture too. I sincerely wish horror games never left this era because it's so cool to look at. Restricting a player's view to a focal point in the environment and severely reducing their awareness of what's ahead is a pretty goddamn easy way to make them panic when things don't go to plan. It also draws your eye to important items or parts of the scene that make for visually intriguing moments. Though 9 times out of 10 you're gonna miss something important along the way and spend hours searching around the place trying to figure out what the hell you're doing wrong. You get some downright cinematic shots in RE Remake that bring so much character to each individual room, either by giving you a sudden close-up of Chris or Jill, or by giving you a big wide shot that highlights the whole area. They aren't just used to scare you or heighten the stress of what's going on. They are there to convey a whole mood on their own and visually tell a story for each little scene that you walk through. Now, if there was any camera perspective that could possibly elicit the same sort of responses in similar situations, it's first person. The view is restricted to whatever you happen to be looking at because that's how eyes work, and that makes for some really intense moments. Throwing open doors is a relatively slow process that feels like an homage to the door animations of old, and simply entering a room is a big moment in itself that plays out similarly to the classic games. You open the door, take a beat to soak in what's ahead, and then venture on to see what's around the next corner. First person makes the game feel way more claustrophobic than it would otherwise, especially with how shallow the field of view is. Scanning the environment for items and clues is more impactful since you can see all of the tiny little details, and when a monster tries to get to you, it's so close you can almost smell it. Can't wait for some sicko to mod that feature in. That close-range blast you get from every little moment is what makes first-person horror scarier for obvious reasons. And not just because it's like you're really there because wow, immersion, but because this stuff is bigger and doesn't have a degree of separation that third-person or even fixed camera angles give you. Things tend to feel at least a bit more frightening most of the time because they're coming directly for your eyeballs. And RE7 is the spooky game, so all these decisions make sense. And the way the usual RE exploration plays out is exciting because of it. Scouring each room in the baker's property and finding helpful items is a fun process in itself. Not just because you feel like a little guy rummaging around the place, but because you get well rewarded for doing so. RE7 handles resources like the classic games where you'll only find a set amount of ammo and health as opposed to magically collecting bullets from falling enemies. And it's usually pretty good at communicating where you should look. Shelves, drawers, cupboards, and little nooks and crannies here and there will likely reward you with some handy supplies. And when you search around like this, you start to notice the attention to detail that's in RE7. Every grotty little patch of mold or portrait showing members of the Baker family before their moldy turn, and it's moments like this where the experience really lines up with the older games. When I take it slow and just look around for a bit, I know that Capcom did a good job with making RE7 a true return to form. But you know what RE7 weirdly has less of in comparison to even RE1? Combat. I might be crazy, but it feels like the moments when you bump into an enemy in RE7 are sometimes pretty rare. You don't even fight your first proper zombie-like enemy until you reach the basement of the Baker house, which may take you up to an hour to reach. And enemies don't respawn once you put them down, just like the older games. It would have been cool to see a Crimson Head style feature come back like in RE Remake, where if you kill a molded, there would be a chance it could come back as a souped up enemy. Kind of like the enemies Chris has to deal with in the Not a Hero scenario. But because combat is fairly uncommon at certain points in the game, what you get is a pretty chill experience for the most part, which on the one hand makes exploration a little boring after a while, especially when every enemy type basically functions the same as the next, and there's not much visual differentiation to throw you off either. But on the other hand, I think having enemies be much rarer occurrences kind of makes them more interesting too. How much of that choice is influenced by the game being in VR? Where too much combat would cause people to literally pass out from the exhaustion. Or perhaps it's a reaction to the series' intense level of action in the past, a knee-jerk motion to pull away from those elements to deliver something fresh and much slower paced. Either way, it was odd to spend a large part of my first 6-hour playthrough and only encounter what felt like a handful of enemies every so often. I might be exaggerating here, but I really do think that out of all the RE pillars, combat seems to be the least important thing in this game. Boss fights are sick though. Chainsaw Deathmatch and Marguerite's weird spooky chase are weird, but very fun. And those moments are so good specifically because I think there's less of a focus on combat overall, which also impacts resource management because I don't think I ever remotely struggled with that at all. Which is a bit of a shame because resource management is half the fun of these games. And when I have too many resources, then managing them isn't much of a problem at all. When I search the environment, I should be rewarded with more ammo and healing items. But then you've got too many to use if you're too thorough, and the economy of everything gets busted. So, yeah, there's no solution to greed except paying for the price of... I don't know. I had a line there and I blew it. The key takeaway from all this is that I think RE7 wants to be a distinctly slow experience. And sure, that's how basically every RE game is on the first playthrough, with some obvious exceptions. But here, I think it's even more apparent. You can't even skip cutscenes in this game, which definitely hurts my desire to want to put some more time into getting a better endgame time, but you know, it is what it is. RE7 tries to walk the line between offering up moments and atmosphere that lines up with the classic games, but also has stuff that adheres to more modern styles of horror too. There's plenty of jump scares and times where you're suddenly thrust into a dark area to panic for a second or two before moving on. And the paranormal haunts courtesy of Evelyn do make for some funny moments. But really, the name of the game in RE7 is to be as disgusting as humanly possible. And because it's first person, you've got no choice but to look at every little detail. And thanks to RE7's high fidelity, this stuff looks so real I can taste it and I really don't want to do that. And that right there is one of the things that makes RE7 stand out from the prior entries in the series. RE7 is trying to be an ultra-immersive experience first and foremost, so the environments adhere to a very photorealistic style, which does make aspects of the Baker house feel lived in and well thought out. But I also... what happened there? But I also can't help but feel like this location has a pretty boring aesthetic compared to nearly every other classic RE title. There's the mansion, RPD, Raccoon City, and every location from RE4, and they all elicit different but equally iconic visual styles. The mansion was like a big creepy haunted house that featured plenty of little puzzles and enemies around every corner. Exploring it was exciting and rewarding because of how each trip out from the safe room felt like an actual dance with death. And failure by dying or using up resources was a real problem. RE2's Raccoon Police Department is similar to the mansion but has the added benefit of having some areas be exclusive to Claire or Leon. Aesthetically, it's also bizarre because it's a police station that was formerly a museum, so you're never quite sure what you'll see when you walk into a room. It gave the RPD variants that made it cool to explore and lent itself well to puzzles that got to get a little weird at times. Sure, the key mechanics of exploration are mostly ripped from RE1, with sword keys now being diamond keys and so on. But aesthetically, RE2's mood is entirely different, and that's what makes it feel fresh. You compare those sort of visuals to RE7, and we get something that's refreshingly different, sure, but not necessarily memorable, I don't think. The problem here is that RE7 is just emulating a spooky house without much of a distinctly unique style, which isn't to say that all of RE7 is one big blob of the same sort of thing. The game gives us plenty of distinct locations, but I wouldn't say many of them are approaching the iconic scenes of what we had before. And I think that's where the bakers themselves are supposed to pick up the slack. They bring the wacky world of RE back to life by offering distinct horror tropes in different formats. Jack Baker is the Terminator, Marguerite is the body horror lady, and Lucas really liked watching the Saw movies as a kid. But I can't help but feel like this is a step back from what the other games have done. To be fair, this feels like a problem more so endemic with photorealism and conventionally good modern visuals in general. I think it's hard to offer up distinctly unique aesthetics in a style like this without putting in a ton of work adding in the right details to make everything coalesce in the right way without pulling the player out of the experience somehow. But there's definitely room for that to work, as proven by the RE games made after 7, whose visual styles bring back some of that really cool design work. But on its own merits, RE7 does some awesome stuff visually. For a start, I think these small chase sequences with Jack are really neat. It's hard not to make an enemy that chases after you a little scary. By that same logic, Marguerite is really cool too. Not as cool as Jack's boss fight in the basement though. Again, a sudden chainsaw death match is too cool to compare. She does get a boss fight of her own that's really cool though, where it's like a game of cat and mouse inside a big disheveled shack. She's creepy, the area's creepy, Ethan's kinda creepy too, I guess. Something else that RE7 does really well is have certain scares be genuine surprises. There are plenty that aren't, which have some build up before the big finish, but sometimes you get little subtle moments that have a really big impact. Most of them are to do with the granny. After certain progress points, she will just appear out of nowhere and say and do nothing except stare at you. There's also that one time where she sings for a bit. That was off-putting. These moments remind me a lot of Fear, whose fairly monotonous environments and simplistic locations would make it hard to tell if a spooky moment was coming up sometimes, which gave these areas a genuine element of tension since there was no real way to gauge what would be next, a combat encounter or a little run-in with armor. I also feel like in terms of size, the Baker property feels kind of small, especially in comparison to RE1, which surprisingly feels like a much bigger game than this does. Now that could be due to the door animations forcing map-wide travel to feel a little slower, or my mind just playing tricks on me. But I really feel like RE7 has less of a presence because of that scale difference. And because traversing it doesn't really feel very dangerous most of the time, it's hard to feel as engaged in the atmosphere like I am in RE2 or RE Remake. But what is scarier than being in a creepy place in a horror game? That's right, getting stuck on a puzzle in a creepy place in a horror game. And when that happens, you're just left to stew in the atmosphere and get real acquainted with the mood of the setting. Even if the puzzle is taking forever to figure out, I'm still enjoying it because I'm being forced to sit there and figure something out while I'm hearing whispering and shit and it gets overwhelming. Why do I enjoy this? Puzzle design is something that RE has gone back and forth on for its entire lifespan, with most puzzles revolving around getting a key that unlocks a thing or slapping together two things to make a bigger, more important thing. Every now and then you'll get a genuine obstacle that requires some thought, like the Plant 42 chemistry lesson in RE1. But those are pretty rare. Puzzles in RE7 are a mixture of the simplistic, smush some items together style, as well as some that require a little more thought. The shotgun puzzle, though, is essentially a beat-for-beat copy of the one in RE1, except there is not a hilarious death trap to make you regret not saving for an hour. Then you get some light illusion puzzles, which are really a lot of fun. I just wish that the game had way more of them because they're really good. The most complicated puzzle is the Happy Birthday puzzle, and it's unfortunately got some stuff that annoys me. Happy Birthday is a puzzle that results in you dying and having to do the whole thing from the start if you mess it up. And solving this puzzle relies on you watching a videotape that tells you the answer you need to avoid the main death trap. The problem is that this puzzle has you follow through some very specific steps, and the game assumes you know that you can just skip certain steps in the puzzle to get past the thing that usually kills you. And if you don't realize that that's something you can do, you'll end up dying a few times before begrudgingly googling the answer because there's no real indication of what to do if it simply doesn't click with you. In concept, this puzzle is really cool. But if the punishment for failing a problem like this is just dying and having to do everything again, you've made your puzzle the worst thing I've ever had to do on the third go around. The punishment for failing a puzzle should be the feeling of being a total idiot and wasting time, but never being forced to redo everything from scratch, unless it takes like 10 seconds tops. Redoing a bunch of steps over and over again till you hopefully realize what the game might want from you is not fun. Because when that happens, all of the tension and all of the atmosphere that the game has built up just got thrown into a tire fire because now I am just annoyed. I don't know though, skill issue, bad Lamau. Yeah. So yeah, RE7 is a spooky game, I guess, but also it trips up on itself in a few areas that matter to make the overall experience a little less engaging as a horror game. With that said, there's an area of RE7 that I haven't touched on yet that basically ticks all of the boxes, and this might be where this video gets a little controversial. The boat section of RE7 is pretty infamous for having a fairly mixed reception, I think, and I can definitely see why that would be the case. You go from the Baker House and its surrounding areas, which are the game's whole selling point, and one location that you can freely explore in your own time, and then once you get to the boat, everything suddenly becomes a little more linear. Now you can either feel like this is a giant step back from the game where suddenly its key aesthetic and level design have taken a turn downward, or you may enjoy the change of pace and appreciate the differences that this last section of the game has. I tend to fall in the latter category because I think the ship may be my favorite part of the game. There, I said it. On the note of it being a linear section, that's basically how every RE game gets by the end. This is essentially the big Umbrella Labs moment where the game's key twists and turns are revealed. And almost all of those sections in previous games were very similarly laid out. The difference here lies in the videotape that has you exploring the boat before the big mold incident happened, courtesy of Evelyn. Just like how you have other videotapes give you context for an upcoming area before you get there yourself. This one shows you the general layout of the boat before Evelyn broke out and made everything really moldy. At this point, this section is a nice break from the norms of RE7 by giving us a brighter, more action-packed scenario. And then it thrusts us back into a changed version of the sim location, back to that grungy state that the boat is in currently. It encapsulates the devastation that Evelyn was able to dole out, and it gives us some much-needed variety at this point in the game. This is also one of the only locations in the game that got me feeling a little tense, since the enemies blend into the background so much more in this area than they do elsewhere, to the point that I was getting jump scared by the crawlers a lot because I just couldn't see them until they were right in my face. The one thing I definitely agree with is how easy it is to get lost in this place. So much time is spent running down the wrong corridor because you aren't quite sure what you missed, or if you missed anything at all. One of those times where the first-person perspective ends up making the game harder because your eye may not be naturally drawn to wherever you may need to go. And yes, I am referring to that one room where you need to escape it by looking up and to the right and climbing through the weird little shaft in the wall. I was lost here for about 40 minutes, I think, just running around. The boat's biggest problem is the way it sort of flips RE7's tone on its head. The game is supposed to feel like a non-stop ride where you're balancing resources and struggling to keep up with what's against you, all the while not being sure of what may happen next to Ethan and his weird hands. But then you get an SMG and hundreds of bullets, and also bombs that eradicate any enemies in your way, and then RE7 sort of becomes a somewhat generic action experience yet again. Like I said earlier, I don't think the resource management aspects are balanced all that well anyway, but doing this completely obliterates the sense of mechanical tension that makes this style of RE work in the first place. What we then end up with is something that sincerely does try to go back to its roots and realign the series' priorities back to the spooky side. And it does that successfully for the most part. And looking back on it, it's kind of neat to see where the series found its new footing. Just like how RE1 was the beginning for mainline survival horror, RE7 kickstarts the new era of Resident Evil, which has already given us a bunch of cool stuff. RE7 is not a game I like to replay much because it's something that works better when it still feels pretty surprising. In fact, this is only the third time I've played through it in total for this video, and that's out of the norm for me and RE, but that highlights what RE7 is about. It's a shake-up to the series' established rules and a return to a mode of play that put RE on the map. And when everyone got their hands on it, it was a genuine surprise to see Capcom take RE back in this direction. And I think playing it too much sort of ruins that aspect of the game. Looking back on it, I think it's disappointing that its aesthetic is pretty generic and falls in line with a lot of other horror games of the last decade. RE had always felt like the leader in those terms, pioneering a lot of different visual styles and evolving them over time to make each game feel unique in its aesthetic. But RE7's attempt to course correct, while successful, ended up making a game that doesn't visually stick out in my mind much. So I guess the ending statement of this video is, thank you, Resident Evil 7, for reinvigorating the franchise. I think you're really neat, and I don't think I'll play you again for a very long time.